Welcome again, friends. We had been talking about the reservations of some scholars about the term Commonwealth literature. The strongest of the objections has been from Salman Rushdie, himself a writer in this domain. In spite of these objections to the nomenclature, the term Commonwealth literature makes a lot of sense because the Commonwealth of Nations, as it stands today, is a decentered network that closely resembles the other commonwealth of the humane imagination which is enshrined in no constitution of language or earth but must remain forever a utopian project. The field of study covers a wide variety of creative experience excellently expressed in several non-native Englishes. This variety of creative artistic expression in these non-native Englishes coming from a wide variety of cultures within the nations of the Commonwealth attributes a strength and a contemporary relevance to the idea of Commonwealth literature. Of the many arguments that can be submitted in support of the nomenclature Commonwealth literature, there is one that heavily underlines the significance of keeping the consciousness of history alive. It is the history of the arrival, the stay, and the metamorphosis of the language and the culture of the British in their colonies that constitutes the beginning of the circumstances that later became the foundation of what has now come to be known as Commonwealth literature, a denomination that only became formally known in early 1960s. The military victories of the British made to acquire territories in their colonies could never be enough to govern the people of those territories for longer periods, and therefore the British introduced their language through the modern educational institutions they started in their colonies. These institutions, schools and universities, were the centers to propagate the idea of the superiority of the culture of the colonizer through the colonialist literature. What is now known as post-colonial literature has major contributions from the countries that had formerly been British colonies. Post-colonial literature in English, thus, has its roots in the colonial literature beginning in different times in different parts of the Commonwealth of Nations. Thus, while colonial writings in English began in Australia and New Zealand as early as towards the end of the 18th century, they began in South Africa in the first decades of the 19th century. The beginning of colonial writing in Canada, India, and the Caribbean can be dated around the middle of the 19th century. From these different beginnings, the literatures of these nations have taken more or less similar courses to acquire the character of the post-colonial. That course to the acquisition of post-colonial character for each of these nations and territories from around the world has gone through the processes of the appropriation and indigenization of English language, of the assertion of national identities, and earning of political independence, of rejection of the hegemony of the culture of the colonizer, and of the privileging of home of native cultures, and of the rewriting of national and cultural histories. Talking of the arrival of the term post-colonial and its first use in the field of literature, Eyþór Quayson writes, "The earliest instance of the word used in a largely temporal sense and with a hyphen appeared in academic writing in 1910 essay by T. W. Allen in the Journal of Hellenic Studies with reference to some minor poets of the pre-Homeric era. In various scattered instances up to 1950, it was used in historical journals mainly with reference to early American and Latin American republics. Its first use in literary studies, again unhyphenated, appeared in 1958 in the journal Comparative Literature in an article by Justus M. van der Kroef on the colonial in Indonesia, translated from Dutch. This excerpt from the introduction of the Cambridge History of Postcolonial Literature tersely sums up the journey of the term postcolonial from its arrival in academic discourse to its appropriation by the world of literature. As it derives from all of the processes that the nations of the former colonies have gone through, the term postcolonial literature covers better and more of the ground than the term Commonwealth literature. There is a very clear technical reason why the denomination postcolonial literature should be preferred over the denomination Commonwealth literature to designate the field of study we are entering. And that technical reason is the overwhelming presence of the elements of postcoloniality in the field. It would serve well here to quote Helen Tiffin, writing in support of the term postcolonial literature in preference to any other term distinguishing this area of study. The term postcolonial is not synonymous with the term post-independence. For all the difficulties raised by the postcolonial as a category applied to literary studies, it has proved more resilient than such possible alternatives as new literatures or world literatures or Commonwealth literatures, because it implies the persistence of colonial legacies in post-independence cultures, not their disappearance or erasure. The post in the postcolonial is not confidentially posterior to an epoch, but rather a product of it. As can be gathered from her arguments, Helen Tiffin is all for replacing the term Commonwealth literature with the term postcolonial literature, which she finds the most resilient of all alternative terms used to designate the field of study. However, the denomination postcolonial literature too has been contested by scholars. One of the major problems with the term is that it brings in too many discourses to be accommodated within the purview of the field, such as feminist writings, cultural and countercultural writings, the writings about ethnicity, the Afro-American writings, and a variety of resistance writings. The inclusion of all of these writings and the discourses in the field through the denomination postcolonial literature only makes the field a disorganized domain of political contestations. The many objections to the denomination postcolonial literature can broadly be categorized into three segments. First and foremost, the term opens itself up to bring in the concept of hegemony of ideas and culture to be resisted, thereby effectively bringing in the whole of the so-called second and the third worlds into the coverage of the domain. Second, the prefix post in the term postcolonial seems to imply that the writings to be let into the field should be from the time after the end of the colonial rule in colonies. Such an implication would leave out some great works produced before the political independence of the former colonies. For example, Chinua Achebe's celebrated post-colonial text, Things Fall Apart, came 2 years before the political independence of Nigeria. And the third, the way post-colonial has gone and been defined in the past decades creates a situation of Euro-Americocentrism that leaves the long pre-colonial native histories of the former colonies out of the purview of the term. Away and apart from all of these objections to it, the term post-colonial obviously shifts the focus of the field of study from former imperial colonies to the current ideological and cultural colonies of the USA. Such a shift effectively leaves the term postcolonial redundant or devoid of its original sense. Bruce King appears to have been aware of the problematic trappings of the term and therefore uses the denomination of new national literatures to designate this area of study in his book New National and Post-Colonial Literatures, an Introduction. In a crucial part of the first chapter of the edited book, which is his own contribution, Bruce King avoids using the term post-colonial. While talking about the history of literatures in this field of study, the new national literatures began with the first European explorations overseas. Language, culture, literature, and education developed along with trade, domination, administration, and settlement. Explorers, traders, conquerors, travelers, and pioneers were some of the early European writers. There was a parallel literature written by non-Europeans who came into contact with the European expansionism. Of interest as examples of how cultures view each other, the literature of cultural contact remained in the subtext of other themes as settlement and colonization began to produce writing specifically by and about the colonized, administrators, and settlers. Bruce King's suggestion of the term the new national literatures is the closest to our field of study, which we have named New Literatures in English. While the nomenclature New Literatures in English includes the core themes of the terms Commonwealth literature and post-colonial literature, it also opens up to literatures from territories and nations that have never been militarily and politically colonized by the European imperial powers of the past. This new nomenclature, thus, is limitedly restrictive while being reasonably open. Friends, in these two parts of the talk, we looked at the efficacy and appropriateness of the term New Literatures in English. We also looked at the alternative denominations to designate the field of study and the objections to those denominations. In our next talk, we will begin looking at the geographical and cultural locations of the texts in this course. See you then.